Hi girls, we are on Learning Target 1D, which is the origins of life. We've already discussed a lot of these questions or parts of these questions in prior sections of this learning target. So some of this is going to be repeat, and also we looked at it a lot in our Origin of Life lab. So you should be familiar with that, with some of these concepts already. So I'm going to just go over them briefly. Our first question is, can you describe the geological, molecular, and genetic evidence for the origin of life? Well, it's important to know what those words mean. So geological has anything to do with the earth, molecular is going to be small within the cells, small molecules, and genetic evidence is going to be is basically DNA or RNA, anything that holds genetic information. So starting with geological evidence that supports the model of the origin of life on Earth. So Earth was formed approximately 4.6 billion years ago. However, that was not nearly safe enough for life to have formed at that point. It was way too hostile. So the earliest life could have formed was about 3.9 billion years ago. And the earliest evidence, fossil evidence, so that's our geological, earliest fossil evidence supports life from about 3.5 billion years ago. And so this gives us a date range in which we can predict that life formed between 3.5 and 3.9 billion years ago. As you guys saw in lab, it can be hard to believe at the beginning that, so out of nothing, there's just life. So it's a really long process to get us to where we are now, obviously over 3.5 billion years. And it is actually fairly simple to be able to form complex organic. Organic is going to be anything containing carbon, and you're going to see that in life. Organic molecules from inorganic molecules. So we did that in the lab pretty easily, where we were able to form our coacervates, which is one theory of how life formed, because we saw that from two non-living things in a little bit of a hostile environment, by adding that hydrochloric acid, we're able to form things that have signs of life or that have similarities. From there, through that process, we can see that life would be able to form. Our molecular and our genetic evidence we can take from both extinct and extant organisms. So extant organisms are going to be the ones that are still alive, and they, through that DNA evidence, we can see that they came from a common ancestor because of all of those similarities. And I talked about this previously. It's actually pretty easy to believe that all of them would come from one species because there are so many similarities that all life has. Whereas if we were all formed from different things, we would not share that many similarities. That's really at our root of what we are. There's also scientific evidence that supports the fact that the molecular building blocks are common to all forms of life, such as carbohydrates and proteins, lipids and nucleic acids. Those things can join and then have, specifically these monomers can produce polymers, and those have the ability to replicate, to store, and transfer information. We don't necessarily know how this set of reactions occurred to get to where we are now. However, it could have been in like what we called our organic soup that was covering the beginning of Earth, or it could have happened on a solid surface. But what we do know is that there were definitely some very complex reactions that were occurring that can take inorganic molecules to form organic molecules, and then that formed our very early life between 3.5 and 3.9 billion years ago. From there, all life came from that because of our geological, our molecular, and our genetic evidence. There's so many similarities that it is very difficult to dispute that. All right, here's our next question. Can you describe the sequence of changes that led to the evolution of life from the universal ancestor to the present? This is a huge question because there is so much that has happened. However, we want to focus in on, okay, so that beginning, We know that we're starting from that universal ancestor because of all of those similarities that all living species or all living organisms share. So that's our start. And we have evidence that evolution has occurred in all species. We can see it today, for example, with chemical resistance, emergent diseases, and with our directional phenotypic change. We saw that in the last video where we saw the graph, and directional is where the main species are here, and then directional is where all of it moves over. But the biggest one we can see is in that chemical resistance when, for example, they always tell you when you go to the doctor, make sure you finish all of your medicine, because if you don't, you can actually create antibiotic resistant bacteria, and from there, those species are going to reproduce, and eventually they become resistant to the drugs that we have and that we take. So that's showing that that species is in the process of evolving to be able to survive whatever drugs they are being exposed to. We see that a lot with also when they're trying to eliminate certain species such as mosquitoes. They try and spray all the mosquitoes with a certain chemical, and the really strong ones are going to be able to survive, and those ones reproduce, and now they're resistant to that treatment that we had initially done. So we're creating all of these superbugs when we don't effectively kill off all of that organism. All right, can you explain the RNA world hypothesis? So the RNA world hypothesis, the main thing to get from this is that RNA could have been, and probably was, the earliest genetic material, so our genetic material holding all information for life. Now, the reason that they are so convinced that it was RNA was because of something called ribozymes. So many proteins are categorized as enzymes, and the purpose of an enzyme, we'll do an enzyme lab at the end of the year, the purpose of an enzyme is to speed up a chemical reaction, and it's really necessary for a lot of the processes that are occurring in the cell. So we found out actually in the 80s, so pretty recently really, that RNA has the ability to act as a catalyst just like an enzyme can. So when RNA is acting as an enzyme, it's called a ribozyme, and they're actually able to cut RNA into 2 smaller pieces, and that showed that it was able to take over that job of what we usually have enzymes doing. So that means that that possibly could have been occurring as our first genetic material, because it had that ability to act as something that can store and transfer information, and also act as an enzyme. So once again, RNA world hypothesis, most important thing though, is that RNA could have been the first genetic material.